Okay, Jake Villwock back here again. Today we're going to tie a fly that a lot of people have been waiting for me to do a video of, so here we are. This is my roamer, but this is on the triple platform, so it's got a shank in the back and then two hooks. And one of the reasons why we do the shank in the back and then two hooks versus a hook, shank, and a hook is that that back hook holds a lot of weight. And so if you make a bad cast, which we all do, there's a lot of times where that fly will wrap around on itself and hook itself. And you hate it when that happens right when you got a one-shot spot and you don't get the fish out, it comes back and it flies in a giant ball. So what we found, and this is also not just me finding it, it's talking to a lot of my buddies that are streamer fishermen and designers, is that little shank creates like more of a wagtail or a rudder. So it really helps keep the weight off of that. So the majority of the weight is in the front. So that front of the fly really directs where that fly is going to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, this is, as I do a lot of my flies that are over engineered, but the roamer was designed originally as a single hook striper fly. And over the years, it's evolved into a bass fly, a musky fly, a lot of different species of fish. And for smallmouth in the springtime, the more movement, the better. And I found that with a couple shanks or articulations, this fly just moves a little easier without having to manipulate it manually so much. So we're going to tie one a little bigger than this. This is kind of my fall, end of summer or slightly off color fly. This is the triple. It's in the same length roughly as the single that I originally tied, but in the springtime for smallmouth, especially when we get away with a little bit bigger flies, I like to upsize them a few times. So we're going to go ahead and start with this. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take a 13 millimeter shank. This is a spawn shank. You can do a 15 if you want, or a 10, but I think that 13 actually just holds the perfect amount of material. So thread we're going to use Danville 210 in the chartreuse color, and we're going to go ahead and start by kind of just filling in a nice thread base here of that material, or excuse me, not of that thread, of that shank. Can't talk anymore. Now the first thing we're going to do after that, or the next thing we're going to do, is we're going to take some bucktail. And we're going to create a little bit of a spine with this bucktail. I really like to use bucktail as a spine when you're putting feathers in there because it just adds a little bit of rigidity to that, kind of junction. They don't overlap on themselves quite as much. One thing I just did without explaining was I actually stacked that bucktail a little bit to get those tips a little closer together. And what we want to do is have about 2 inches or so coming off the back of the shank. So right on the top, we're going to tie this in. Try not to get it to spin too much, but the beauty of bucktail is if it does spin, you can always manipulate it back, and that's going to create our little bit of a spine there. What it also does is it creates a tiny little tie-in platform for the feathers that we're going to use. And we're going to see if these feathers work well the way we want them to, but sometimes feathers have a mind of their own, so we're going to kind of step away from that. We're going to throw a little bit of flash down now. And one of the reasons why I like to put the flash down now is that one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of streamers is there's a lot of flash moving around on the outside of the fly. And most of the fish that we're imitating don't have a lot of things hanging off the outside of them. So what I want to do is I want to create like an internal flash almost. I want this kind of flash to bleed through. And you'll also notice that right there when I cut that off, I didn't just cut it straight. I cut it with a little bit of a taper, so there's different angles there. It's not a lot of flash, but when we put those feathers on, when it gets wet, that flash will kind of just bleed through there just a little bit. Now, with this one, we're going to take this is a whiting American streamer saddle feather. And what I want to do, and one of the coolest things about Regals is they have kind of different points on them like a lot of vices, but I've just become accustomed to it, is I want to use that material magnet right there as my length, and I want that to be about a ½ inch to a quarter to a ½ inch, I should say, past that. So I'm going to strip off some of these fibers here to get down to just a standard exposed quill, and we're going to lay that there just to make sure we're in the right spot. Okay, we're good. Now when it comes to tying in feathers, you've got a round quill and you've got a round shank. A lot of times when you tie in round to round, you'll end up with a feather that kind of goes all over the place. There's a couple different things you can do to tie this in. One, you can try tying it in just straight on the top of the shank like that, and we're going to see if that works. So we're going to tie that in right on the top and see if that doesn't move. Now that's actually pretty good. You don't have a lot of flare on there. But another thing you can do, and we'll do that on a different feather, is you can take a pair of hemostats and actually smash the barb flat. But we're going to tie a white and yellow, and so we're going to take our longer, a little bit stiffer feather and use that as the base, and then we're going to take a slightly smaller, a little bit more wispy feather in a grizzly color, and we're going to lay that on so it's going to be about 2/3 the length of the shank. Now this particular one, and this is where you can run into an issue with the smashing, is that's a really thin and brittle spine or stem, so you don't want to smash it too hard, but we're going to try see if this works. Now you'll be able to tell immediately if this thing kicks one way or the other if it didn't mash perfect. See how that just mashed and moved a little bit? We're going to see if that's enough to not move, but if it does, I'll show you another way to fix that problem. So we're going to lay that right on this side. I'm going to tie that flat. Now this actually worked, but I'm going to get this feather somehow to line up perfectly. So that actually works. So see how that laid flat on there? Sometimes they'll spin one way or the other, and that can be a problem. So to get these out of the way without moving them too much, we're just going to slide our and then cut them down. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side, but I'm going to show you one other way that a buddy of mine showed me the way he does it. And what he does is he leaves a little bit of that fluff on there, and he actually cuts the fluff right above the quill itself, and then he's going to lay that on the side. And a lot of times that quill, well, this is a perfect example. See that? Flared out like that. So that didn't work. So what we're going to do is we're going to try the top thing one more time, like we did on the other side. We're going to lay that flat on the top, tie that straight down, and boom, you've got it. So again, there's different ways to do it. So you can mash it, you can lay it on the top without mashing it, or you can cut those little quills down, and sometimes that works. So we'll see if we can go 4 for 4 and not have any issues. But sometimes it's a little bit more than you can ask for. But that actually laid smashed pretty well. Okay, perfect. So we've got them all laying flat, which never happens the first time, so I'm very happy about that. Now to make sure these things don't go anywhere, well, I'm just gonna be a little OCD and get those all perfect. Now, make sure they don't go anywhere. We're gonna hit this with a little bit of UV glue. But before I do that, I'm gonna move my thread back, and there's a reason for that. So we're gonna hit that with the light. That's gonna make sure those things don't pull out. Now, with the triple, I'm trying to maintain the least amount of weight that I can, but also fill all of the gaps that I can. So instead of using bucktail right here to create like a kind of a gap filler or a little bit more structure, what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 white hen saddles. Now these are going to be a little long, so we might not need them all, but we're going to just pretend we do. And we're going to peel this down, leaving a little bit of an exposure there, and we're going to lay them backwards. But you notice I also pulled all that back. The reason I did that was because that's going to help separate those little fibers. Now, when it comes to tying this in, you don't want to tie it over that, because just like the just like woolly critter brush or any of that kind of dubbing brush style material, if you wrap over the material, you're gonna have to wrap once or twice before it starts to flare out. So we want to take just a little tiny bit of that quill, and we just want to wrap straight back to that, and we're going to go forward. Before we get too close to that hook eye, we're going to cut all this little fibery stuff off. This is just something that has to happen. There's one more on there, but we're going to let that disappear. Now we're going to take this and we're going to try to get it to lay back mostly, but if it doesn't, that's okay. That's one of the nice things about using 2, is it gives you a little bit more structure in there, and it helps lay those fibers back on themselves. And we're just going to kind of fill this all the way in. This also starts to create a little bit of taper of that material in the body of this fly, but again, reducing the weight of this. So we're just gonna, so right about there is about all I want. And what I'm gonna do when I tie this off is I'm gonna pull that up. I'm gonna go kind of weasel my way through that material, pull it back down, and then once I make my first wrap, she's secured in there. I'm gonna make a couple securing wraps just to make sure nothing bad happens. Cut that off. Now we're gonna do one or two more just to make sure. Couple whip finishes here. Again, this is specifically tied for smallmouth bass, so you want to make sure that any exposed thread has a coating of something on it to help protect it, because these smallmouth can chew this stuff up. So we're just going to kind of, without getting too much anywhere, we're just going to dabble that with some UV flow. Hit that with the light, and we're good to go. So when I take this out, I'm just going to make sure we're going to manipulate these feathers just a little bit, but water will do that for us. But that's going to give us our nice little tailing piece. You'll notice too when you flare this up, that kind of gives you a really good transition between those. And again, these feathers are going to have a mind of their own until they finally get wet. So as I want to mess with them to get them where they need to be, we're just going to leave them alone. So next thing we're going to do after we leave set that there, we're going to take a size 2 Ahrex Light Stinger. Again, I love these hooks because of the hook gap, also the fact that they can bend out a little bit and you can bend them back. And we're going to throw that into this hook jaw. Now, one of the coolest things about this hook jaw that a lot of people don't know, they just kind of throw the hook in just like that, like a regular jaw. That's fine, but if you want it to hold with the most stability, push that in there. You also no longer have a hook point sticking out, and that gives you a really nice tying point. So to secure that back shank on, we're going to take a little bit of wire. You can also use 25-pound Maxima Chameleon or any type of hard mono for this. You don't have to secure it in too much because there's no hook on the back, so you don't have to worry about fish getting attached to that and pulling it out. So we're not going to super worry about all of that stuff. So one of the things you'll notice too on this is I made a very light thread base, and that's going to come into account once we get a little bit further up the shank on this hook. So we're going to tie in this wire, and we're going to try to tie it in about 2/3 of the way up. So we want to make sure that we got enough space here to spin some deer hair to create the body, but we also want to make sure we have enough that just in case something bad happens, it's enough structural integrity there to hold that in. So we're going to fold this over. I lied, we're going to back up first. Then we're going to fold this over, tie that in. You only need to make a few wraps because now you want to see, okay, where am I on the amount of this thing being able to foul? Where's the movement of that? So we're going to back over that and just give it a nice little loop. We don't want too much. And once I get there, I'm like, okay, that looks pretty good, but I'm going to try to pull that. Didn't work, so I'm going to loosen up a little bit. Just pull that just ever so slightly and then go back down over that, creating a relatively small loop there, but enough so you can see there it doesn't really fold over too much anymore, but you still have a lot of structure there and you're going to have a lot of movement. So we're going to wrap this forward right about the same spot you were. Cut that wire with your pliers or a bad pair of scissors. Now, one thing I really like to do, and it doesn't necessarily matter so much on this step, but on a lot of other steps we do, especially when I'm doing an articulated one where I'm going to put a rattle in it or something like that, I'm going to take a pair of hemostats and I'm just going to smash this. The other thing I will say is there's a flat piece there. You don't want to use a serrated part because it'll chew up your thread. I'm just going to smash this wire so that it's all even and it's on my side. So if you are going to tie in a rattle or something like that, now you have a flat surface to tie that rattle in. Just like a quill to a feather and a shank, rattles are round things, and round things don't like to stay. So you've got to kind of create a little groove in there, and a flat spot works out great. Now, just for the sense of an example, to make sure this thing never goes anywhere, hit that with just a little tiny bit of glue. You don't need a lot. Always remember to close that up because I have 3 pairs of my favorite pants that now have giant things of super glue on them. We're just going to wrap backwards right to there. Easy enough. Now, we're trying to make a profile of a bait fish, a rubber fluke, some sort of jerk bait, any of that stuff. We don't want a lot of material on there because we want it to be easy to cast. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill up 2/3 of the shank with UV polar chenille in the pearl color. And what this does, again, is it creates a little bit of dimension to your fly. It creates that bleed through. I believe Tommy Lynch says that it gives a nuke egg effect to his fly. On his Drunken Disorderly, he uses something similar to this to create that kind of bleed through. But what I'm trying to do is imitate almost a soft plastic, style of fishing or lure. And you'll notice that on all soft plastics, all of the flash kind of bleeds through the actual material. So that's what we're trying to do with this. We're trying to create this bleed through of this material, but also filling in as much as we can without using a lot of material to keep that structure, soft. Excuse me, keep the structure there, but not a lot of material. I've mentioned that like 5 times. Sometimes when I'm tying this fly, if I do want it to push just a tiny bit more water, what I'll actually do before I put this down is I will spin some bucktail right on the back end. So you'll actually have 2 tie-ins of bucktail on the middle shank and 1 on the front. But for this particular one, we're going to run 1 over that, and I'll show you kind of what we're looking at for that. So now we're going to take some more bucktail. Again, we don't want a lot, but I will say this: there's a chance that I'll spin this all the way around and I won't like the way it looks. And if I don't like the way it looks, then I'll start all over again. But what we want to do, we're going to move our thread up to about halfway right there. What we want to do is we want to get this bucktail to come about 1/3 of the way over that feather. And the reason we do that is because this bucktail here, this really end pieces, are very, very soft, and they're just going to kind of blend into that material. This fly, we don't want it to be kind of like a clouser style, or excuse me, like a deceiver style where it's, 2-dimensional. You got bucktail up here, bucktail. We want a full round carrot shaped 3-dimensional fly. And so we also don't want what I call a lollipop. A lollipop means that your material all stops here and then you just have a tail wagging in the back. I want this material to bleed into that tail feather. It also, not only does it look nice when it turns into that, it also creates a little bit of structure to keep that tail from moving too far one way or the other. So that looks about where I want it to be. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lay that right on the top. And before I do this, the reason I use 210 versus gel spun is because I love the chartreuse and I love that kind of fluorescent color that comes through, whether it's chartreuse or orange or any of those other colors. But what I'm going to do to make this a little bit stronger is I'm just going to spin my bobbin. I'm going to spin that for about 10 or 15 seconds for the length of me telling you 10 or 15 seconds. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to make 1 wrap, and on my second wrap around, I'm going to pull tight and let that kind of go. Now that's not necessarily always going to spin all the way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my 3rd wrap and kind of separate that as I go. The beauty of having 2 wraps is you can loosen this up and it'll pull itself around, giving you a relatively even structure all the way around. So you can see that goes pretty well all the way around. Now, it might be a little light on one side, but I'm not too worried about that at this point. So we're going to cut all this excess off. Got trash cans over there. And then I'm just going to do a couple securing wraps just to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere. Now, I also don't want this to be flared out super, super wide. So if you notice what I just did there without explaining it again, is I kind of took my thread back a little bit. And every time you take your thread back a little bit, it'll push that bucktail down. But I don't want it to be too far down because I want it to still kind of flare out. And that's what kind of helps add that structure to this fly. But you can see straight through that. So that's going to give you that nice bleed through color there. One of the coolest parts about this fly is with changing one color of the feather on the back and using laser dub. This is Senua's laser dub in here. You can create the entire fly based on a white bucktail and then just change your top colors or your accent colors just by using laser dub. And that's kind of what creates this nice structure. So we're going to take this laser dub and I'm going to pick it out like this. And that's going to give me kind of a good length. That's going to give me the longest fibers that I can. And then we're going to measure this because we want that to kind of lay again roughly the same length over that tail, and that's going to kind of give us that body. But before we do that, I want to add a little bit of flash to this, but not too much. So what I'm going to use is Ripple Ice Fiber in white. This stuff is UV white, so it does capture some of that UV color. We don't want to use a whole lot, so I'm only going to use 5 fibers of it. And we're just going to lay that straight on the top. We don't want it to be any longer than the bucktail itself. I'm going to lay that over, kind of what we call like a 3/4 tie. So we've got some hanging off the front, some hanging off the back. Fold this over on itself and just wrap that up. That's just going to give us a little bit of light, a little bit of extra movement, a little bit of that UV kind of hot spot to it, but not, again, being too intrusive. I don't want a lot of flash in there. Now we're going to take this laser dub and we're going to do a 3/4 tie. So we're going to pull that right about there. We're going to tie that in just like that. Okay, and then we'll take this little tiny clump right here, fold it back over itself, and go right over top of that junction. A couple wraps there, move it forward. Now we can do that whip finish. Now before we do the next step, and this is another important step to this, we're going to hit this with a little bit of UV glue, because the last thing I want to do is have that UV glue, or that thread, it's not UV glued, pop off of there. Get that with some light. Now, just like doing this with a lot of like other dubbing, or if you've already watched my crayfish video, I like to brush forward to pull all those fibers out, but you can kind of see there is still, you know, a definitive junction there between those two tines. But if I brush this forward, what it's going to do is it's going to marry those two together, and then I'm going to brush it back. And what it also does is it kind of flares it out and around that material a little bit, so you get that nice kind of layer over the top. Now this is just the beginning of the color change, so you don't need it to be super heavy on there. You want it to just kind of bleed in there, but you're going to kind of have that bait fish structure, and that's going to work out really well. So again, I mentioned before, one of the coolest things about this hook jaw is that now that the hook stays a little bit lighter, you don't have to worry about getting that right there. That fly just kind of lays flat the whole way across. Next one we're going to do, we're going to add a number 1 Ahrex minnow hook. This is my favorite front hook. Ahrex, if you're listening, I still want to design a slightly better hook for this style. But we're just going to kind of throw that in there just like that. This is going to give me that kind of short, heavier hook to direct that fly through there. Now on this one, because we do have a hook behind on that other one, we do want to make sure that this thing is structurally sound, because we will have some fish pulling on this. So we're going to grab our wire. We're going to make our same kind of light wrap. This is one of the things, the challenge with this fly is you've got to make sure you have enough exposed shank to spin bucktail, but also have enough shank to secure this in here. So we're going to do about 3 wraps to the first one, actually 4, just to make sure that bottom one doesn't go anywhere. It's going to come down that shank just a little bit. And the reason it's going to do that is because we're going to take a red bead and we're going to throw that red bead on there. One of the things that I will say about a bead that's very important is that you can actually make a fly that structurally does not catch as many fish. If I were to tie that right off to the end of that, there would be about a 1/2 inch between both my hooks. So there's going to be a lot of fish that try to eat that actually miss because they can't get either one of those hooks in their mouth. Adding a bead or 2 actually adds some distance between those 2 hooks, but it also adds a little bit of extra movement in there. So we're going to slide that through. We're going to pull that relatively tight, and again, we're going to kind of judge what we want. We want to make sure that this front hook doesn't slide all the way over, so we're going to pull that tight, but we also want to make sure we've got enough in there that it's not going to hinder the movement. So we're going to keep pulling that till we get it to the point where that cannot get over there. Leave that right there. We're going to wrap this in pretty tight all the way up. Snip that off. Now this is where the material clip comes in nice on the Regal, because you can just flip that over and you're right there. Again, sometimes this thing looks like a bad hair day, but once it gets wet, it all kind of blends on itself, and we like that. We're going to hit that with a little bit extra super glue. we're going to make about 4 or 5 wraps over this to make sure that it never goes anywhere. So we'll put it right there. All right, now to fill that junction, we're going to go back to the UV polar chenille here. This time, we've got to be careful that we don't go too far forward because we've got to tie in a lot of material on this front hook to get this movement. So we're only going to go about halfway with this. And this is just going to be enough to kind of go through there. When I first started tying this fly, what I would do is I'd spin the bucktail around, and then I'd add a little bit of flash over the top. I'd add a little bit of, I'd add rubber legs or some sort of feather for fins, and then I'd add red crystal flash for the throat. But I found through some of my friends and just the way I like the way it looks is what we're going to end up doing is instead of using a full throat on the bottom, we're going to take Senyo's Aqua Veil, and this color is called pepperoni. So it is red. It's a kind of a deeper red with a little bit of green in there and some kind of UV enhancing. So we're going to tie this in, and we're going to make 2 to 3 wraps. And that 2 to 3 wraps totally depends on how I like the coverage of that red, because we want this red to bleed through that fly. So that looks pretty good, but just for the sake of fun, we're going to do 3. And that's really going to add, again, a little bit of structure, but it's also going to add that kind of bleeding through look that we like. And you can already tell that that flash itself will cover up that junction. And that bead, seeing that bead's not a bad thing because it's red. So again, adding a little bit of that, kind of bleeding through motion to it works really, really well. All right, now bucktail. We're going back to bucktail. One thing I totally forgot to mention, and I'll tell you this now, is as I tie this fly, I tie from the tip of the bucktail down to the bottom. So that little spine that we used to secure those feathers in was from the top. The first hook, the second section is from like kind of the middle, and the bottom, or the front hook will be from the bottom of this. And what that does is as you go down the bucktail, it's a little bit stiffer. And so again, we're building kind of micro structure through this fly. So we want to make sure that we kind of get that that thicker, heavier stuff down towards the bottom for the front. Now, continuing with that taper, we're gonna measure this. We want to make sure the tips of this section of bucktail go to about halfway down the section of the other one. We don't want a hard stop of this material. We want it to kind of bleed into itself. So that looking right there is about what I want to do. Now this time we're going to reverse tie it. So I'm going to take all this extra stuff off and I'm going to cut it into the trash can so Steve doesn't get mad at me. Move that thread forward just a little bit. Spin my bobbin. Now we're going to kind of spin it around so the tips are forward. We're going to 1 wrap, 2 wrap, and we're going to pull tight. And if with any luck, this is going to be pretty close to exactly the way we want to. Now, to push this back with your fingers is a giant pain in the butt. You can use a Bic pen if you want, or what I would highly recommend is this little thing called the Protojon. It is a 3D printed bucktail thing that grabs on these little angles that bucktail and will push it straight back. I love that because then it doesn't move that bucktail. If you have a flat surface like a Bic pen, it will actually kind of pull that bucktail one way or the other. So one hack to that is get a little file or a knife and just throw a little bit of little cuts in there and it'll hold that bucktail. So you'll notice I've got this little junction back here in between the butt sections and the tips. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to push this bucktail back. Now I love the way that just kind of folds right over, kind of disappears into the back of that. So I'm going to grab all this bucktail. Instead of creating a dam to push that back in a kind of a taper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and right where that tie-in underneath this is, I'm just going to go all the way around and I'm going to pull tight. That's going to flare that bucktail back out. But now you have this little tiny kind of groove in there, and that's going to help tie in other materials into that groove right there. So the only thing I'm going to tie in at this point, because we've done the throat, is we're going to take some rubber legs. I like rubber legs for the pec fins because rubber legs adds a little bit of structure to this. If you use a natural material like a hen saddle, they look awesome, it looks natural, but then when it gets wet, it just kind of folds over on itself. Again, creating microstructure is what I'm really trying to do here. So I'm going to take one white barred Sili leg and I'm going to cut it in half, and then I'm going to fold those two in half again over the thread, and I'm going to take this straight down to the edge, one thread wrap, two thread wraps, and it's good. Do the same thing on the other side. So we're going to come up on that. One wrap, two wrap, secured. Not going anywhere. Well, I'll do a third one for fun. Then you want to make sure that they don't go anywhere. So I'm going to come from the bottom first. I'm going to hit this with a little bit of glue, keeping it upside down, because that's going to make sure that those bottom legs have a little bit of stability to keep them up. So you'll notice they don't fall quite as much now. And then on the top, we'll do the same thing so they don't migrate one way or the other. Just like that. Okay, so now we've got kind of a bigger one. This is definitely a specifically for a spring smallmouth deal. It's so easy to cast. Now we're going to continue that kind of taper of color, and what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did in the back with that laser dub. We're going to kind of marry it out, get my kind of rough idea of what I want in the amount. Now, the one thing that I'm going to do different on this than I did on the back is we're actually going to reverse tie all of these tie-in points. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the length that I want, and then I'm just going to kind of come down a little bit, trim that off. I've noticed when I first started tying these, I used to do the kind of center tie over, and I was having a lot of inconsistency with how this fly swam, and it was because I was using either too much or too little laser dub. Well, this adds a really nice knuckle of material. So we're going to pull that tight on one side, and you'll notice when I pull that back, that kind of gives you a good bleed right into that next one, or that rear one. So we'll do the same thing on both sides. And as I'm doing this, I'm now kind of looking at the one side to see roughly how much it is, because you want the sides to be as close as you can to the same diameter, or I should say amount, because denseness is the word I'm looking for actually. Because if you have one side heavier than the other, the fly's gonna favor one side when it's swimming. So keeping it pretty close to the same size is the most important. So we're gonna go ahead and tie that in. You want them. It's very important you keep them on the sides, because if you keep them, if they migrate one way or the other, then you end up with a goofy looking head, and a goofy looking head doesn't catch fish. So it's got to look good in the vise for it to actually catch fish. So now with the top part, we want it to be kind of as structurally sound as possible. We want to have a little bit more density, and we want it to be long. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure this out, see if we can get it close to that other side. Just kind of double check. Now, to add the density to this that we want, instead of cutting that off and letting it fall on the table, even though it's just a little bit, we're going to fold that over, cut that off, and keep that in there. And that just gives us a tiny little bit more material for this knuckle that we're creating with this reverse tied laser dub. So that's the top portion of it. Now we're going to grab some white and do the same thing on the bottom with the white, except because we don't need as much of white on the bottom, we're just going to kind of, well, I should say we don't need as much, we're only tying in once. We're just going to kind of almost center tie this, fold it over, cut that, and then we will spin this vise just so you can kind of see us tie this in, just like that. Now you'll notice that I went away from me on that so that I don't unspin what I just tied in. Now you've got a lot of material forward, it's hard to get that thread through there. The easiest thing to do is to kind of go color coded, pull that yellow back, pull that white forward, come straight up through, pull that over there. I'm just going to wrap a few times here, and we're going to whip finish. Now we still have kind of a bad hair day, which is fine. Whip finish that. And then we're going to hit this with a little bit of UV glue before we do the next step. The thing about the UV glue too is you can actually, while I'm talking, this UV glue is kind of bleeding into that material. So you can kind of see I've got that kind of overlap there of that front material. This, you can actually get a pretty good taper of the head. So you can kind of pull that back to about where you want it to be, push it forward, and then I'm going to hit it. And that's going to stay just like that. That's going to give you a little bit of structure there. It's also going to, kind of give you a nice taper. So now what I'm going to do, if I roll this around, you can kind of really see those 4 tie-in points. I'm going to brush all this forward. And as I brush this forward, it's going to look like one of those dog cones that you get on that your dog gets when he goes through surgery. So it's all facing forward, but now you've got a continuous tie-in there. And you'll notice that giant bulk of laser dub. That's what's going to keep a lot of that front structure to push this fly through the water. Move all that extra hair. Push this back. Just like that. So, bad hair day, but when I pull that down, you'll notice that it kind of comes down a little bit, and that's roughly the shape of that fly that you're going to get in the water. Now when it gets wet, it's going to kind of mash down a little bit more and create that really nice kind of carrot shaped fly, but you also have movement, and this thing doesn't weigh that much, so you can cast it all day long and still have fun. So that's the roamer and the triple. I will mention one thing one more time. I did say if you want it to be a little bit bulkier, you can do 2 tie-ins of bucktail on that first hook or that middle section. So right before you start putting in that UV polar chenille, you can run another set of bucktail. But I've noticed that it swims a little bit better when you only do 1 and 1. And the original fly had 1 and 1, so we just kind of keep it like that, and that's how we get that extension, but also that same fly. So there it is. Thank you.